Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. It's a pleasure to be here and to be able to introduce you to a project I've been working on for some time. Today I've got Ghazi with me from Darth Publishers and Ayat Mneina, who founded the Libyan youth movement around 10 years ago now. And yeah, I'm the artist's son, Sherif, and I'm working on a project at the moment that's sort of bringing together different bodies of my father's work. And yeah, this event's in association with the Liverpool Arab Arts Festival. So first of all, I'd like to say thank you to them and to Jack, who's been very helpful. They do amazing work, and this year they start events on the 16th of July onwards. So make sure you give them a follow on Instagram and social media. They also, yeah, I want to say thank you to their sponsors as well, the Arts Council England and Liverpool City Council. So yeah, I approached them some time ago to tell them about a project I was working on and archiving my father's work. And today I've launched a website, alsatoor.com, which is an extensive archive of my dad's work. It contains thousands of pieces of work spanning 4 different decades. It also contains a biography to read. There's going to be a forthcoming video this summer to accompany a London exhibition. There's other information to check out on previous exhibitions. For now, it's just in English, but by July, it will be available in Arabic too. It's still being tweaked in parts, and due to the sheer volume of work and lack of manpower, these kind of things take time. I'm very proud to launch it and to share it with everybody today. Feel free to browse and ask any questions. Shout out to my sister Hannah for all of her help, Luke Padjak, who's been very helpful, and Chris Wren, who's also been super helpful on the website. If it's satire you're interested in, you can browse month by month and see a huge collection of my dad's cartoons. More will be placed in the archive over time too. It's by no means a finished article. And the collection of actual artworks is growing too. There's around 70 pieces in there now, with approximately 250 more to come over the next year. My dad's artworks are scattered all across the world and come in all different formats, from paintings the size of postcards to canvases 2 meters wide, digital drawings, photography, sketches on the back of napkins. If you have one, let me know. I'd love a photo of it, and I promise not to come and steal it. I thought I'd speak, first of all, a little bit about my dad's backstory and fill you in on how he entered the world of art and satire, but also a little bit about him as a person. Some of you may have known him personally, and I'm sure if you did, you've got your own stories to tell. So, you know, I believe my dad's story is one that deserves to be celebrated and told, not just to Libyan people or people with a Libyan background or people who knew him in the northwest of England, but to anybody who can really understand or relate to the struggle against a higher power, and also anyone who appreciates art. So yeah, my dad, he was born in Benghazi in 1955 in the newly formed Kingdom of Libya. This is a picture that he called Benghazi Blues, which he did in 2007. Yeah, my grandfather was Sheikh Mahmoud Dhaimish. He was a religious man who played a role in social reconstruction in the city, and also worked for King Idris at the time. I guess this is where my dad inherited his critical thinking and the ability to speak his mind and express solidarity with the weaker parts of society. So yeah, this picture in particular is from a collection that my dad calls called Sketches of Libya, which is sort of a nostalgic look back on the time when he grew up in Libya, but also, slightly before then as well. He always looked back on that period of his youth. So from the age of, from being born to 15 years old, he looked back on that with a lot of happiness, and he considered Libya to be a very prospering country while he was growing up. I thought I'd share with you a few words from an interview from 2014. When the military coup happened, my life turned upside down. In 1969, despite my young age, I didn't see any point in the coup. I loved King Idris. The country was safe despite the spread of poverty at the time, but there was hope for an improvement in living conditions as there were developments in all fields. Gaddafi's voice and his accent was strange, which raised my doubts about him at the time. And when I saw him smiling, my suspicions increased. His wicked eyes were full of hatred and backwardsness. As a child, I didn't feel any affection towards him. I started to follow his speeches. My mother was telling me when she saw me listening to his speech, "What do you expect to hear from him?" My response was that I was waiting for the time that he would reveal his real personality, that I always felt he was hiding from us. And it didn't take long till the mask fell off. So shortly after Gaddafi came into power in 1975, so at the age of 19, my dad left Libya, like a lot of young people did at the time. And he came to England with a desire to live life as a young man. And here are some pictures of him sporting an amazing afro there. He loved music, which inspired almost all of his art later in his life, from reggae and dub music to funk and disco music. He loved to party. Yeah, I guess he did. He wasn't proactively involved in political movements at the time, nor, as far as I'm aware, it didn't really interest him. He was too busy living his own life. And at that time, he was living in Bradford, West Yorkshire, an area that many migrants fled to from the 1950s onwards, mainly from Pakistani and Indian heritage, as this is where there was still industry in England. And my dad stuck around there for a while, but soon after he left for a town called Burnley, which is just over the county border in Lancashire. Now, whenever I look back at this particular period in my dad's life, a poem always comes to mind by the wonderful John Cooper Clarke, and it says, "I tell you now, and I tell you firmly, I don't ever want to go to Burnley. What they do don't concern me. Why would anybody make that journey?" And yeah, I mean, my response to that, to Mr. Clarke, is why wouldn't you want to go to Burnley with such beautiful countryside? I mean, here's a picture of my dad with the amazing Lancashire background. It may not be the shores of Libya in the Mediterranean, but it's not a bad sight. But anyway, it was here where my dad met my mum, Karen, and they fell in love. And at that time, my dad was sort of on the run, avoiding deportation. He'd been denied political asylum, but once they were married, he could call Burnley home. And yeah, it was around a year later, they were in London together, and he spotted a Libyan opposition magazine on a stand outside Earl's Court station. He bought a copy. He wrote to them and explained that he wanted to contribute some cartoons and send them some samples of his work. And they snapped his hand off at the offer. Here's a picture of him at his desk doing some cartoons, some doodles, which is pretty much what he did his whole life. He was always at his desk drawing. So yeah, that was sort of through the 80s. He was publishing for a couple of various magazines, cartoons like such. And again, these are collections that I'm still sort of growing through my own research. So if anybody's got any information that they'd like to share, please do get in touch. I don't really want to fast track through my dad's life, but time is of the essence, of course. And so yeah, that was what he was doing in the 1980s. And then by the time the 1990s came, things changed for him, and satire came Second, to education and artistic exploration. Oh, here's a picture of me as a baby reading one of my dad's magazines there. But yeah, he basically, in the 90s, he revolutionized his approach to art. And that started with him taking a computer course in 1990. I recently spoke to an old friend of my dad's, a gentleman called Will Barton, who inspired my dad to study art and changed the direction of his life. So, you know, he completed his A-levels, his foundation, a degree at Bradford University, and then went in 1995, he went on to teach graphics at Nelson and Cone College. So yeah, he'd embarked on an education for himself and for others, and that education will continue for the rest of his life. This is one graphic from, you know, like the late 90s. You can kind of get a sense of sort of like his influences from people like Keith Haring, and you can also, like I said earlier, you know, you can really see the influence of the music he was listening to. He was doing, at the time, he was doing all sorts of artistic projects. You know, I can remember him freezing items inside glass heads and avant-garde videos and all sorts of stuff. You know, he was very experimental and sort of saw no limits at all to his work's you know, ability, really. And at the turn of the millennium came the rise of the internet, and here are a couple of other examples of his digital works from that time. But as with the rise of the internet, this is when he really started to become prolific with his satire work. And I'll move on to that now. And basically, he knew the potential of reaching people. He no longer had to rely on magazines to be distributed among people. You know, he saw the potential of reaching a global audience with his satire. So after the teaching day was finished, he would shackle himself to his desk and he became Satur. And that's when he basically, you know, he would be watching news stations. On the side of our house, we had all these different satellites that were picking up all sorts of stations. And I have some words here from him talking about that time in his life. The internet was an effective method in my fight against Gaddafi. I would always get complaints from Libyan authorities on my YouTube channel, but it never stopped me. I was constantly being targeted as I never set myself limits. People would complain that Satur had exceeded the limits of morality, and they demanded I deleted my insulting cartoons of the colonel and his family, but they were to no avail. So yeah, around this time during the mid-2000s, my family were harassed online via Facebook, email hackings, and threats were sent directly to me and my sisters. But, you know, at the same time, my dad's popularity was growing and growing, and his ability to sort of produce work digitally was improving as well. He was making a lot of progress. And by the end of the 2000s, he'd be publishing probably around 3 to 10 cartoons a day on average. But then other times he would do nothing at all for months on end. And it was a very tough time for him. He'd been away, at this point, he'd been away from Libya for 35 years, hadn't seen his family, and there wasn't really any sign of change soon. But yeah, so at the same time, you know, this is where he was developing his other artistic skills, which was taking, you know, very, very different to the satire he was producing, worlds apart, in fact. Here's a picture from his studio at the time from, I think this is from around 2008. This is an artwork he was working on for, it must have been a couple of years. It kept changing, and, you know, he'd keep going back to it and making changes. But a lot of his work, the subjects were around African-American culture. And he once said, "I love jazz because of its melody and the conditions from which it appeared. I identified with the history of Black people in America based on my own suffering and persecution." But anyway, we'll go back to satire in a second with a little bit of an artistic interlude there for you. There's Dizzy Gillespie on the left, Ella Fitzgerald on the right. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe, no, I think it is Ella Fitzgerald. Anyway, back to satire. And in early 2011, when the revolution was brewing in Libya, he became prolific. You know, I counted over 1,500 cartoons for the year 2011. And that doesn't include any of the work that he was producing for the television station he was working at in Doha at the time. This is around this time he started, you know, to become known to people who he was. He didn't really have to hide behind a pseudonym anymore. And once Gaddafi was gone, he continued to publish cartoons criticizing people from all different sort of, you know, the international audiences and other political players in Libya who were getting involved. But then he would also always pay tribute to sort of fallen human rights activists, lawyers. You know, there was a lot of assassinations at the time, and he would always pay tribute to those because he saw them as his brothers and sisters in arms. Anyway, listen, I could talk for hours about the different sides of my dad's personality and, you know, his artworks, but I won't. I've got two amazing guests here to say some words as well. But I just thought I'd just say a few final words on sort of like the last few years of my dad's life from my point of view. And I really think that he was totally sort of subsumed by Libya's poisonous political landscape in a way. You could consider it his golden era for satire, you know, and he was able to freely connect with Libyans. And I think that he needed that in his life, but it all came at a cost, of course. You know, he sacrificed his home life, his job as a teacher, and he didn't have much capacity to produce works like this, like from this picture you can see here. Which I think he, you know, part of him really wanted to, but instead I think that speaks volumes for his selflessness and commitment to promoting freedom of speech, which, you know, proved to be stronger than his desire to paint. And yeah, I'll leave that there from me, and I'll pass over to the wonderful Ghazi to say some words.
Thank you, Sherif. That was it is a real pleasure to be involved in this project, and I'm really honored to be a part of the launch of the Alsatoor website. I wanted just to speak a little bit about the historical background in Libyan cartoons, where Alsatoor or Hasan Dhaimish came from. So Libya has gained independence, as you said, in 1951, and the artistic and also artistic culture started to flourish since then. I start with the first slide, which talks about I think the quintessential cartoonist and Libyan cricketer, which is Muhammad Zawawi, Zawawi. Zawawi was one of the first people to establish cartoon or satirical cartoon in Libya. And he was self-taught. He's a guy who was immersed in the social fabric of Libya. He's also born in Benghazi, and he found himself producing pieces of cartoon for newspapers at the time in the 50s and 60s, and his cartoons focus mainly on the social aspects of the country. So they are much detailed, and there is a lot of color. I'm talking about him because it will make sense when we talk about the second generation, which Hasan Dhaimish Alsatoor came afterwards, to see the contrasting elements in both works, and also the next generational. The wave of next generation who came afterwards. And during the 60s, late 60s and 70s, there was stifling of political life in Libya. So Zawawi concentrated more of his work on the social aspects of the country and the struggles that the country goes through, or international affairs where it is safer to criticize or make fun of other people. I think the next slide will show some examples. So this is like a cartoon from, I think it's the late 60s, early 70s. I think it's early 70s mostly. And these two Libyan men who are beside the petrol. So that's just being leaking. So the oil has been producing in the country, but it is aspect of the wastefulness of the country and how the oil is being wasted. And that's one of the things that he talked about. So people are not aware of their priorities or what exactly they want to talk about. The cartoons speak for themselves. I think the next steps, next slide will also show another. This is another one where similar thing. The social aspects of giving services to the people. So services like here, the electricity company is electricity has been there is electricity outage and people are trying to come and speak to the manager, which is still, I think, even in today's Libya, there is the similar problems. The next slide. And this is also another more recent work. Zawawi died in 2011. And these are like international satirical cartoons that he produced about United Nations trying to find the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, trying to find them in the mouths of kids and poor people. So that's also another aspect of his political satirical side that is more of an international, has an international aspect. So it was, I would say, more allowed in Gaddafi's Libya. If you criticize the West or criticize imperialism, that would have been with the consent of the regime at the time. So he was a pioneering in many ways, and especially on the social aspects, and also the way the style that he used, which is very detailed style. These are black and white. There are some of them that are colorful, and he also talked a lot more about the social aspects of the country. Next slide. So now we come to to Hasan Dhaimish. This is a picture of Hasan. Hasan, I would assume that he also saw and grew up with Zawawi's cartoons, but the way he diverged completely from Zawawi is that the way he came as a young man to Britain, and I'm sure that he was influenced by a lot of the satirical flavor of British cartoons, which is more of a slapstick, more of it goes towards the deeply to the establishment and deep into the political aspects of the country. And I think that he learned a lot from that side, but he kept, I would say, true to the spirit of Libya, being always about Libya, being always about the political struggle in Libya, and also being, I would say, a political animal who was completely independent and completely autonomous. So people couldn't. Part of his work is also that he liked to work in the shadows, and that's also something I myself, when I came to know his work, everyone knew the work but didn't know the person, and I think that is part of the appeal or part of the attractiveness about his work, is that the work that speaks about itself, not the person, and the person is in a way immersed in the work. The work is everything is dedicated to the work and the message that comes from the work, and maybe it's also part of the not only the culture in Libya. It's a part of the culture of Libya is there is humbleness in it, whereas people produce a lot of work and they are sometimes renowned, but there is the humble side of them that makes them always try to stay away from the limelight and produce the work and stay away from people, you could say the fans or the people who want to know more about your life, and being also private. And I guess that gave him the capacity to produce and be free, and that's very important for somebody who works in the on the satirical side of creativity. I think the next slides would show some examples of his work. So this is exactly what Sherif was talking about, that in the later years, Satoor managed to grasp really the way of using digital media in producing a tremendous amount of works in a very short period of time, but very effective. So that's very important. And the way he did it is that he didn't have any, I would say, any taboos. So he broke everything, and some people found them distasteful, I would say, but that's the way he wanted to shock the system and produce things that will make people question. And this is one of the pictures, and he always didn't shy from making fun or producing work about even the most sacred parts of society, and or even people that weren't in the main fore of the regime. So that's also very important. Next slide. Yeah, and this is also another one that is very minimal in a way, and there is the use of not only digital media, but also giving center stage for a picture. And that's what he also produced later on, giving pictures and distorting them through different tools. And then, yeah, this is Saif al-Islam Gaddafi, who's the son of Gaddafi, who was dubbed as a reformer from 2006. But in reality, he was the shadow. There is the shadow of the father from behind him, and also making fun of the father with this weird-looking Mickey Mouse hat. Next slide. And there's another one making also fun of Saif al-Islam Gaddafi being like with a big head and trying to breach Cyrenaica, which is eastern Libya. Next slide. And then afterwards, I think even after 2011, that gives you how authentic he was to his work, which is even after 2011, he didn't shy from talking about what is going on in the country. Even after the change of the regime, he was in opposition all the time. So I think his default position was opposition to authority, opposition to a government that is not speaking the will of the people. So this is a picture of one of the prime ministers that after 2011, Ali Zidane, and he's like a butcher trying to give positions of like ministries and positions of the government, like giving somebody pieces of meat. So it's very quite strong, and it's the way he uses it is very easy, like putting the face of the person that he wants to talk about on a picture that he can grab from the internet or from another source. Next picture. And this is the similar way he criticizes the leading names in the new era or new regime, as if they were setting in the sunset. So it's very, very poignant and very strong. Next slide. So that's, I think, mainly what I wanted to talk about. The last bit of it is want to see the influence of both people on the new generation of satirists. So this is like you, Al-Ajali Al-Abeidi. He is a satirist in Libya. He's a cartoonist, and he is more influenced with the work of Zawawi. So you can see the influence there of similar way, and people still rotating around that detailed, more international aspect of satire. Next slide. And this is closer to what Satoor used to do. So there is a work of detail, but in the same time, it's about the situation in the country, but it's also digitally produced. Next slide. This is all more detailed, so it goes on to talk about the situation in the country. You can see different aspects, different cartoons. Next slide. And this is another cartoonist who is basically trying. Yeah, he grew up in the school of Alsatoor, so you can see the aspects of cartoonist side, the easygoing way of using the lines and the colors, and and it is quite interesting to see how these two schools of thought, or these two schools of artistic way of using the cartoons, has been moving since then. Next slide. Yeah, that's the end of the slides. So I think that is what I have in. I think in conclusion is that we owe a lot to Satoor of producing such work, especially in a difficult time before the 2011 revolution and then afterwards. And I think his legacy continues to move on with the newer generation who grew up reading and also consuming what he created. And the story still continues. Thank you.
Thank you, Ghazi. That was brilliant. Yeah, thank you so much. It's so nice to see the sort of the comparisons you draw, and also sort of the differences as well. I think that's it's a very strong point. And one thing in particular really stuck out, which I never really thought of when you said that my dad's default position was opposition. I think that's entirely true, and that comes from his I guess what you could call a sort of like a punk attitude, where he never really agreed with authority. And I mean that was prevalent in lots of other aspects of his life too. So yeah, it's very interesting to hear that as someone from an outside observer to hear those words, and I appreciate you taking the time to put that together. It's fascinating and an education for all of us. Ayat, I would like to pass over to you if that's okay.
Sure. Thanks, Sherif. And thank you for having me here today. I'm really excited to be part of the festival, and also this launch of series of events that will be highlighting Alsatoor's work, I imagine, over the next year or so, and a very much needed time. I think some of the things that struck me with what you both spoke about today was Alsatoor's resilience over the last 4 decades, and his insistence on being an independent voice throughout. As a member of the diaspora, from my experience, I didn't obviously come to attention to his work in the 80s before I was born, but certainly the fact that he dared to depict Gaddafi and the regime in any form was groundbreaking, because it was that dangerous to speak out so candidly and to, make fun of the regime. Gaddafi, for me, always kind of signified like this eccentric, bizarre emperor with no clothes. That's kind of how I always perceived him as a kid. And I think that spirit is captured in Alsatoor's early work with the Mickey Mouse ears. Also kind of reminds me of Banksy in a way, with the really simple but impactful way of depicting. There was no mistaking what he was trying to say or get across. But I think one of the strengths of his work and why it became so powerful over the years was that he had his set of values, and obviously I don't want to assume them, but someone can read between the lines of there's some certain things that he believed in, and he didn't compromise. And there was a large effort in the diaspora and in the opposition to kind of get together, collaborate, and attempt to take down the regime, and various factions formed over the years. And you could see how easy one could get swept into one of those things. And for him to be able to discern, you know what, no, I can't back this, or I'm going to remain independent because that's going to give me my voice, and that's going to allow me to continue to do what I want. I just think that that is so commendable and really difficult to do, because it is not without a huge sacrifice of being alone, and sometimes alienating yourself. But the power of satirical caricatures, it lies in the fact that you get to have this really detailed view, and everyone on the other side of that lens is, you know, potentially a target for your critique. After the revolution, we could, like you said, you know, it turned into this digital art that he was producing thousands and thousands of pieces. Many people in the opposition, you could say, you know, kind of put their feet up after 2011. They had achieved what they set out to do, you know, effectively dethroning the regime, or perhaps being able to take positions of power themselves. We have seen over the last 10 years quite a bit of chaos that has devolved since. But if you look at the rate at which Alsatoor produced cartoons and how he continued to work, it was like there was an urgency. There was more of a fire being lit that, you know, we need to get this right. We need to realize what it was that we're doing, why we set out to dethrone the regime, or why we wanted to get rid of Gaddafi. And I just think that, you know, he certainly carried on a tradition that perhaps was started by the generation before him. I could see his impression on many of the works today, but it's very difficult to reproduce the impact and the messages that he set out to do, because it continues to be dangerous. The security issue is, you know, something on the ground, but has certainly spilled over into the online world. As you said, Sherif, that your own family received threats in the mid-2000s, and that's only become, you know, a little bit more difficult, perhaps more entrenched in today's world. And so looking at satirical cartoon in Libya today is very much, you know, it's kind of always a trade-off between, you know, these not one-offs, but there is no one that is as prolific, because to build that reputation is to put in that sacrifice and that time and put yourself in danger time and time again. And so I think that's certainly a space, that a void that he's left, you know, for sure. And that it needs to be taken up. He's definitely part of that community of activists, of journalists, of media that need to keep holding power to account and demanding transparency, even if it does rub you the wrong way, or, you know, if in a conservative Libyan society, so many of the things that he may have said would have ruffled feathers, but it was certainly worth it. And I hope that this archive will continue to kind of hold that, keep that flame going, and inspire, you know, the next generation to continue to do that. But those were the two kind of things I wanted to highlight about his legacy that really struck me. And yeah, I think we can open it up to our discussion, as we mentioned.
Yeah, sure. Of course, like if anybody's got anyone watching, if you have any questions, please fire them away. I have a question for Ghazi and Ayat. What do you think my dad would have made, or rather, I talk about him as his persona as Alsatoor. What do you think he would have made of what's going on in Libya today? I suppose he passed away 5 years ago, so yeah, I guess things are very different in some ways to what they were 5 years ago. And you know, I can openly, you know, to me, like I'm not politically affiliated or whatever. And I remember at the time that my dad was a staunch supporter of Haftar for a couple of years before, and I think that really was more to do with him, my dad being loyal to his home city of Benghazi more than anything. But a lot of things have arisen since then, and it's a complex situation. But I'm intrigued to hear what you think he would make of today. And yeah, if either of you have any ideas on that.
Go ahead, Ayat.
Yeah.
Oh. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if there was still this flurry of, stream of critiques and, cartoons that he would probably find himself feeling compelled to continue to make. His style, especially in the most recent, and especially how the digital world kind of really helped him do things very quickly, was, he was really trying to get his message across and wanted everyone to hear it very loud and clear. So I can't imagine him turning away. However, it has been a very difficult decade. So I imagine would have taken a toll, and it's been long enough for us to kind of watch political kind of patterns take shape, look at what all the different actors are doing internally and externally. His pen probably would have been just as sharp, if not sharper.
Yeah. Oh,
I do agree. Yes, I think I imagine that it's very hard to predict, but at least from his previous work and the way he was always in opposition, and also that I think he had also a despise for politicians, and also for centers of power, whatever they are, whether centers of power lie in the military, or in the tribe, or in the regions. Or I think he would have probably made fun of the whole situation, because there is an absurd sense of what has been going on for the last 10 years. And I think he captured that absurdity, and I would imagine also he would have continued to do so.
Yeah,
definitely.
I agree. I've had a couple of interesting questions come in. One from Rafika, who asked, I wonder, did Gaddafi privately enjoy any of the satirical cartoons or artists? And I think that's a really good question, because my dad's always, his intentions were with these images, he hoped that they would reach his targets. He wanted to for them to he wanted them to affect him, and sort of affect his confidence, and he wanted to know that my dad was picking up on certain things, whether it was, if Gaddafi started to look like he was having surgery in his particular part, my dad would always, sort of blow that out of proportion. And if he was starting to look a bit sort of tired, he would always draw him with much more tired and look much more beat up, maybe him dribbling. So yeah, maybe he did enjoy the cartoons to a degree, but then I would probably think if he was seeing, dozens of them appearing daily, maybe after a while he didn't enjoy them so much. Maybe as a megalomaniac, he probably enjoyed the attention for a while, but then I think it's pretty well documented that the colonel was quite a paranoid person. So knowing that somebody's watching his every move was probably quite daunting. And my dad wasn't the only one doing this. People were doing this through the written word and lots of other mediums. So and Adam has asked an interesting question regarding sort of the opposition newsletters and magazines. Did he mail in his art anonymously, or were there a few editors who knew him personally? And did he feel that it was a more dangerous time for his art than subsequent periods of his life? So first off, I believe he knew the people that he knew the editors he was sending his work to, and he didn't really shy away from making contact with them as himself as Hasan, but he didn't publish his name anywhere. And during the 80s, he worked under the name of Omran. So Alsatoor didn't come until the 90s, I think, or late 80s. So yeah, that was sort of how he operated. And I think that the 80s were a time, this is just going off from what my dad would tell me, they were a time of paranoia among sort of young Libyans Libyans generally, who were being vocal in some way, because it was well documented there were assassinations going on, and people, spies. I remember reading a fact not long ago that it was almost kind of on par with sort of like, in terms of inside the society, it was like Saddam's Iraq or North Korea, in the sense of there being a lot of paranoia. People didn't really want to talk in case someone else heard. So I think probably the 80s were a time where he felt in quite a lot of danger. But then there was the time during the 2000s where, like I said, I remember the phone was tapped, and sort of Facebook was starting to get hacked, and it all started getting a bit weird, especially for me and my sisters, who were very disconnected from that side of my dad's life. So for that to have come into our life was quite scary, to be honest. But then partly quite exciting as well. It was a weird one. But yeah, thank you for that. That's a good question. And got a couple more here. One from Andy Holden. Was Hasan at all satisfied with the part that he played in changing Libya? I mean, my dad was a very sort of humble person. I don't know if he would have even have thought of himself as a contributor to the huge change that was going on, but he did, in a way, I guess, because he kept his momentum up, and he saw his work as serving a purpose, and he never gave up the fight. So he was very proud. And when I went to go and see him in 2012 in Doha, I could see he was sort of in his element there as Alsatoor. It was, I'd say he enjoyed being able to be open to people about what he was about, rather than having to hide behind the computer. And it was kind of interesting to see that those sorts of the way that he would attack people in cartoons. If he saw that person in person, he wouldn't hold back from, say, speaking his mind to them in person as well. So yeah, he was sort of in his element then, because he was around a lot of other people. But yeah, I'd say he was satisfied. But then going back to what Ghazi said about him, sort of his default position being sort of opposition, he never saw it as, okay, now things have changed, things are better. It was, things have changed, but we need to keep fighting to get things better. So I don't think he ever lost that momentum. And I mean, I say he didn't lose that momentum until his last breath. I think his last cartoon he published was a month before he passed away. And he just that was him to his core. That wasn't, it was a persona in a way, but it was him. That's how he was. I've got another question there. Alsatoor's story and career are very inspiring. I enjoyed this very much. Well, thank you. Given that he played a huge role in the uprising, did he ever feel like the uprising may have been derailed? Did he feel a sense of regret towards post-2011 Libya? Good question. And to be honest, from the conversations I had with him, I don't think, I mean, there was a huge amount of optimism initially in 2011. And I say that, just from my interactions with him. I was on the other side of the world at the time. So I was, having my sort of couple of weekly Skype calls with him, and he was very sort of optimistic. But obviously, you know, things sort of you could say fell apart in Libya, civil war, etc. I mean, it wasn't pretty at all. But unfortunately, I think my dad saw the realities of that being a necessity and didn't really expect anything less in a sense. But I guess his understanding, you know, he read a lot of history, and you know, he understood that for things to go down, they have to go, you know, for things to go back up, they have to really hit rock bottom first. And I think, you know, with especially from October 2011 when Gaddafi was killed, I think my dad knew then that, you know, things still needed to go down further, unfortunately, for things to rebuild. And you know, with Libya being a wealthy country with the amount of oil it can produce, unfortunately, he was well aware of the people grabbing power and chasing the money. So that's another reason why he continued as he was, you know, and just continued to attack people who were getting involved from all angles, because he knew that the fight was far, far from over. So I guess that's my impression of what if that sort of makes sense of his attitude towards post 2011. But yeah, I don't know if you guys have got anything else to add. But
yeah, Sherif, I wanted to add just something about, you know, the name that he chose to kind of his moniker that he chose to go under as Alsatoor, like the cleaver, and the fact that it became so prolific and that he was so known, even maybe his identity wasn't for a while. You know, Gaddafi was a very selfish individual who really enjoyed the spotlight. So to have someone that, you know, was undermining him with these cartoons, and that person have a name, even if it is a moniker, to kind of go toe to toe with him, and for it to be called the cleaver and have this, you know, really a menacing symbol, you know, I can't imagine that didn't rub, you know, him the wrong way or get under his skin. And I think that was really powerful, just the moniker and kind of the spirit behind it, and that you know, Alsatoor, you know, he warned everyone, right? That was his name. He was very clear on his intentions. You know, it wasn't about making friends. I think it was about doing the right thing in his eyes. And you know, that was really, I think that was kind of the spirit behind it. But certainly the name still kind of resonates even today, for sure.
Definitely. Yeah, and I remember like I was saying, with my dad's relation to music was very close, and if I remember correctly, his favorite Bob Marley song was a song called Small Axe, which is if you are a big tree, we are the small axe ready to cut you down. And I think that, you know, that sort of like that really captured what he saw he was, you know, what his duty was. And he liked the idea of him being very sort of, you know, behind, working behind a pseudonym, being detached in a way, nobody really knowing who he is, but knowing that he was slowly chipping away at something. And, you know, just from, go back to what I said earlier about the power of the internet, you know, and he really saw that. I think that's really when he came alive. You know, he was doing his cartoons and distributing them, you know, in print. But I remember him saying about how, you know, after a while he was just like, he couldn't be bothered, because he just, you know, it was only when he really saw the power of being able to reach more people, and for, you know, people all around the world to be able to sort of listen to what he's got to say, and, you know, whether you agree with it or not, you know. And I know he used to tell me that sometimes people, this is when his blog started to gain some popularity, but people used to phone him up and ask him to draw a cartoon of them, even if it was a negative one, because they kind of they just, you know, they wanted that little bit of exposure, because which I don't really think he did requests, but you know, it was it did make me chuckle when he told me that. But yeah, I think unless anyone's got anything to add, I think that's sort of it, really. But yeah, thanks everyone for sort of tuning in and watching, your questions, and yeah, Ghazi and Ayat, amazing. Thanks so much for everything. You know, your contribution. And like I said, everyone, you know, there are exhibitions happening. There's information on the website about the upcoming exhibition in London in August. There will be one in Leeds in November. I'm in talks, hopefully have one in York. If anyone is interested in, you know, in anything, or wants to sort of try and produce something themselves, you know, I'm all ears. Just get in touch. Like I said, the website is, you know, it's live, but we'll sort of, there'll be more work featuring on there soon. There will be a translated version coming in July. It's just finding the time to sort of put it all together. So I appreciate any patience. And Rafika, I can see, yeah, I hope to come to Dublin as well. So anyway, thank you everybody for tuning in, and we'll see you guys soon.
Thank you.
Cheers. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.